March 8, 1985. A pickup truck rolls through the streets of Beirut, Lebanon. Concealed beneath crates of vegetables, 750 pounds of military-grade explosives. The target, a religious leader. The mission, assassination. The order, allegedly given by the most powerful spy chief in the world, William Casey, director of the Central Intelligence Agency. But this isn't just another covert operation. This is revenge. 2 years earlier, the CIA lost everything. Their best analyst, dead. Their embassy, destroyed. 241 Marines, slaughtered in their sleep by a smiling suicide bomber driving 12,000 pounds of explosives into their barracks. The largest non-nuclear explosion since World War II. America was under siege. Hostages were being snatched from the streets. The CIA station chief was kidnapped, tortured on camera, his screams echoing through the halls of Langley. The terrorists had a name the world had never heard before: Hezbollah, Party of God, backed by Iran, trained by Revolutionary Guards, and led, the CIA believed, by one man: Sheikh Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah. Casey wanted him dead. He wanted to send a message written in blood. But there was a problem: Presidential Executive Order 11,905. Assassinations are illegal. So Casey went off the books. $3 million. Saudi intelligence. A former British SAS officer. Lebanese militiamen willing to do what the CIA legally couldn't. The bomb was set. The timer was armed. Fadlallah was walking straight into the kill zone. Then everything went wrong. 83 dead. 283 wounded. Schoolgirls. Women. Children. Bodies torn apart in the streets of Beirut. And the target? Sheikh Fadlallah walked away without a scratch. But here's the truly terrifying part. The CIA had the wrong man. Fadlallah was never the leader of Hezbollah. He was never involved in the attacks on Americans. The intelligence was fatally flawed. This is the story the U.S. government still denies to this day. The story of how America's most elite intelligence agency built its war on terror on a foundation of catastrophic failure. The story of the Beirut car bomb. And it begins with an attack that changed everything. Beirut, 1983. The Lebanese capital stood as a testament to years of devastating conflict. Its scarred streets bearing witness to endless cycles of violence that had torn the tiny Middle Eastern nation apart. Into this cauldron of chaos came American troops, their mission paradoxically peaceful in nature: not to invade, but to bring stability to a city teetering on the edge of collapse. Operating covertly within the substantial CIA presence at the U.S. Embassy was Robert Ames, the agency's top Middle East analyst, a man widely regarded as the most knowledgeable person on terrorist organizations and Middle East politics. Ames had previously achieved the remarkable feat of infiltrating the PLO, and now he had been brought into Beirut in absolute secrecy to advise on the growing terrorist threat that loomed over the American presence. Also working in the embassy that day was aide worker and Damrell, who understood the unspoken reality of embassy life. CIA agents were always present, moving among the staff like ghosts, their true identities carefully concealed. As the classified CIA meeting gathered in the building, the atmosphere was one of focused tension, intelligence officers reviewing the latest threats and assessing the dangers that surrounded them on all sides. Meanwhile, through the Beirut streets, a white van wound its way toward the embassy, its driver navigating the bomb-scarred roads with deadly purpose. Very few people saw what was coming. It was the calm before the storm, those final moments of normalcy before everything changed forever. The funny thing about living in Beirut, Damrell would later reflect, was that she never dreamed she would be targeted. The van didn't look like a threat, its ordinary appearance designed to take everybody off guard, to slip past defenses that had been lulled into complacency. The driver managed to enter the embassy compound's basement garage, a security breach that would prove catastrophic. In an instant that seemed to tear reality apart, the entire central section of the embassy building collapsed in the explosion, bringing down 7 stories of masonry and rubble in a cascade of destruction that buried victims beneath tons of concrete and steel. Damrell found herself trapped beneath the wreckage, unable to move anything, her body pinned by the debris. She heard voices crying out in Arabic, "Yalla bina, Yalla bina. Let's go, let's go." 4 young Lebanese men were near her, and with remarkable courage and compassion, they made a makeshift board and moved her out, then started to run with her across the garden, her rescue captured on video for the world to see. She was one of the lucky ones. 200 people were wounded in the attack, and 63 were killed, 17 of them American. The news of the embassy bombing rocked America, with CBS Evening News anchor Dan Rather reporting on the floodlit scene of death and devastation. The 7-story building reduced to rubble that possibly concealed more victims of the massive terrorist car bomb. For the CIA, it was a particularly devastating blow. Half the American dead worked for the agency. From the bomber's point of view, it was an enormous success, wiping out the CIA station and killing Bob Ames, whose loss was devastating to American intelligence capabilities. The director of the CIA said that Bob Ames was as close to an irreplaceable man as he had ever known in U.S. intelligence. That director was William Casey, and Casey was taking it personally. William Casey was not a man to be underestimated. Obviously very intelligent, he was a risk-taker rather than a gambler, an intimidating presence with a notoriously short temper who didn't suffer fools lightly. In many respects, he was a wild man with no time for moderates or those who wanted to make nice with the enemy. Casey directed every CIA resource available to hunt down those responsible for the attack on the U.S. Embassy, marshaling the full sophisticated power of the agency that under his leadership had reached new heights of capability. Analysts were charged with reviewing thousands of intercepts, agents were ordered to go to their informants, and dozens of emergency meetings were called for senior CIA officials. But before Casey could get the enemy in his sights, they struck again, this time targeting over 1,800 American Marines stationed in Lebanon as peacekeepers. The United States had made a decision to put its troops in Lebanon to help stabilize the country, acting as a liaison between the Lebanese government and the warring militias until the government could get on its feet. The majority of the forces were based in barracks situated next to Beirut Airport, a position that offered scenic views from the rooftop, the main terminal, the mountains, the Mediterranean Sea to the right, but was dangerously close to an area of Beirut controlled by Muslim militias. In the early hours of the morning, a truck headed out of Muslim-controlled Beirut on the airport road toward the barracks. At the same time, Marine Lance Corporal Kevin Jiggets was signing off from guard duty, going down to his room in the building where he remembered just taking off his boots and laying down to sleep. As Jiggets settled into his bunk, the van approached the perimeter of the barracks, coming down Airport Road before turning into the parking lot of the main terminal and crashing through a barbed wire barrier. As a peacekeeping force, the Marines' weapons were not loaded, leaving them vulnerable to attack. The face of the driver was visible to the guards as he aimed the truck at the barracks, and witnesses would later report that he was smiling, a chilling detail that spoke to his fanatical commitment to the mission. The initial contact with the truck and the guard shack was what woke Jiggets up, and he reached for his weapon, but before he could react, the world exploded around him. The truck, laden with approximately 12,000 pounds of explosives, detonated in what would be the largest non-nuclear explosion since the Second World War. Upon detonation, the building was lifted from its foundation and pancaked down floor after floor, the entire 9-story structure leveled in seconds. It was an iconic bombing, devastating in its simplicity. A very large vehicle packed with explosives got up to the front of the barracks and was exploded. It wasn't very complicated, but it was a beautifully executed operation from the terrorist's perspective. The next thing Jiggets remembered was 2 white Marines removing rubble from him, the pain not hitting until they picked him up. Both of his legs were broken, and he suffered burns and cuts over his entire body. All that remained of the building was rubble. Prior to 9/11, it was the largest terrorist attack against U.S. personnel in the history of the United States. 241 American soldiers were killed, 240 of them Marines, making it the biggest single loss of American servicemen's lives since Iwo Jima. President Reagan expressed the nation's sorrow and outrage at the despicable act, but words seemed inadequate in the face of such devastating loss. In Washington, William Casey and the CIA were now under tremendous pressure to find the terrorists responsible for the escalating attacks. The problem was that no one had yet claimed responsibility for the embassy bombing, but within hours of the Marine barracks attack, a statement was released to a French news agency by a group calling themselves Islamic Jihad, Arabic for Holy War. The group claimed responsibility for both the attack on the Marines and for another simultaneous attack in the city that had claimed the lives of 58 French soldiers. But no one in Washington had ever heard of Islamic Jihad. It was not an organization they even knew existed. The CIA was caught completely off guard, without the internal structure to handle that kind of threat. They didn't know where it was, what it was, or who was behind it. William Casey was determined that the CIA would find out and bring the perpetrators to justice, and according to some sources, he would go beyond the law to do so. The man Casey selected to uncover those responsible was seasoned Middle East agent Robert Baer, whose brief was simple and anxious not to lose more operatives. When Baer left Washington, his orders were stark: stay alive. Whatever he did, he should stay alive. The agency didn't care if he ever sent a report in, didn't care what he did, just don't get killed or kidnapped. Baer set off and found Beirut to be a city in complete turmoil. There was no other way in except by Black Hawk helicopter, coming in over the sea about 10 feet up with spray going everywhere, approaching at about 200 miles an hour with shelling all around and parts of Beirut burning. It was, as Baer would describe it, the ninth circle of hell. Baer and the other agents immediately began to set up a low-profile operation, understanding that in Lebanon during a civil war, the goal was to be the least important person on the street. They didn't wear suits, always wearing Levi's and scuffed shoes. They never carried a radio or gun in the open, looking like bums that had just wandered off from wherever. They drove beat-up old cars with bullet holes and bald tires, changing vehicles every day when possible. At one point, Baer actually drove a taxi, an old Mercedes that had been painted a bunch of times, all dinged up, looking like what was called a service vehicle. There were just no limits, no laws. It was an amazing environment where they had all the money they wanted and would buy apartments at the drop of a hat. Baer had probably 12 apartments and houses and moved between them night after night, never staying in the same place. As a fluent Arabic speaker, Baer was assigned the role of gathering intelligence on the streets, mainly picking up sources in cars and putting surveillance on places, watching people coming and going. Gradually, Baer's intelligence work started to pay off, and he began to gather information on Islamic Jihad. That intelligence led him to the religious leaders of one of Lebanon's main Islamic sects, the Shia. They knew that there was a grouping of Shia clerics that had started in 1982, and they watched this formation occur with people joining and leaving, names they didn't know much about, but basically understanding that the religious establishment was coming to join in this Islamic resistance movement. The Shia sect was in the minority in the Muslim world, but in Lebanon they made up around half the Muslim population, and critically, they were the same branch of Islam as America's key enemy in the Middle East, Iran. Despite the CIA's limitless resources, Baer's efforts to penetrate Islamic Jihad hit a brick wall. These people were very, very good. They never showed themselves, working out of tenements in Beirut without a name, without an office, keeping no phone numbers. What they began to find out was that the terrorists were very sophisticated in the structure of their organization, and in Baer's opinion, they were almost as good as the CIA itself. They were strictly family-based and impossible to penetrate through conventional intelligence methods. Recognizing the limitations of his own network, William Casey decided to turn to America's only friend in the region, Israel. Israel was a very close ally both politically and in intelligence areas, working with American intelligence as brothers and sisters in the fight against terrorism. The Israeli intelligence service Mossad was conducting its own operations in Lebanon and passed on to Casey what they knew. The Israeli report said that an organization inside Lebanon was involved in the attacks. The Israelis identified a house in Damascus, the capital of neighboring Syria, where they said a Syrian intelligence officer discussed the attacks on the Marines 3 days before the bombing. Present at the meeting was a grandfatherly man with a black turban and brown robes, a figure the Israelis identified as the key player in the militant Shiite movement in Lebanon, Sheikh Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah. The intelligence the CIA and the Israelis developed showed that Sheikh Fadlallah, a Shiite militant, was allegedly at the center and involved in at least the main bombings in Beirut, including the attack on the Marine barracks. Fadlallah was born and raised in Iraq, but had spent his adult life in Lebanon, where he had become an open critic of America's presence in the region. As an Ayatollah, he would give blanket fatwas saying it was acceptable to use force to drive out an occupying power, making him a natural part of the anti-Western coalition. Casey became convinced that Fadlallah had to be connected to the bombings and was a leading figure in Islamic Jihad. At last, Casey had a target, a face to attach to the attacks that had killed hundreds of Americans. According to some sources, Casey now set in motion an operation to assassinate the man he believed had ordered the slaughter. But before he could strike, there was a further humiliation for America. Just 4 months after the bombing of the U.S. Marines, America began a full withdrawal of its forces from Lebanon, a move that many in the CIA believed was sending the wrong message to the terrorists. Pulling Marines out of Beirut was viewed as a victory by the bad guys at large, sending a signal to terrorists in the region that the Reagan administration was a paper tiger, unwilling to follow through on its commitments. Casey felt defeated because he had been part of the administration that convinced Reagan to send the Marines in, and now they were retreating in the face of terrorist attacks. But the disasters were far from over. Casey's first action to rebuild the CIA's damaged capabilities was to send in a new station chief, William Buckley, a great man and solid fellow whose expertise was in paramilitary operations. Buckley, a former commander who had fought in Vietnam, would be the CIA's most important man on the ground in Beirut. But the terrorists had started taking hostages, kidnapping individual Americans with a view. The kidnapping of the Beirut station chief was an unprecedented disaster for Casey and the CIA. William Buckley had volumes of CIA information in his head and memory, and the accounts indicated that Hezbollah was torturing Buckley daily to extract that classified information. In September, proof that Buckley was still alive was released to the CIA by his kidnappers. A video that Casey saw of Buckley being tortured, showing him almost dead, slobbering, barely able to speak. The concern was that the amount of classified information being tortured out of Station Chief Buckley was causing serious damage to national security, and indeed, Buckley's Lebanese agents began to vanish or turn up dead. With the loss of their station chief and their intelligence network clearly compromised, Casey feared the CIA's entire operation in the Middle East was in ruins. For one of their own to be tortured and killed that way, and for the video to reach Casey and the CIA, galvanized the idea that they had to fight back, and if there were rules, laws, or executive orders preventing them, to hell with those restrictions, they were going to get the job done. According to veteran journalist Bob Woodward, in early 1985, Casey hunted for a third party to execute the assassination of Fadlallah, turning to Saudi Arabia as his partner. Although denied by Saudi Arabia and the American government, according to Woodward's sources, Casey and Saudi Prince Bandar met in a classic CIA secret meeting and walked out into the garden, where Casey allegedly gave Bandar a card with a bank account number, instructing him to transfer $3 million for the operation. The Saudis agreed to take operational control, using a former British SAS officer to head the mission, recruiting Lebanese agents to carry out the actual attack to keep the CIA out of the picture. The plan was simple: to strike at Fadlallah using the weapon of the terrorists themselves, a car bomb. A pickup truck was driven into the crowded Bur al-Abed neighborhood in South Beirut, concealing beneath crates of vegetables 750 pounds of explosives. The truck was parked across the road from Sheikh Fadlallah's house, with intelligence suggesting he would soon be returning from the mosque. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, Fadlallah left the mosque after Friday prayers, but then a woman stopped him to ask a religious question. The delay meant the detonation timing was off. Fadlallah was too far from the bomb when it exploded. The blast killed 83 people and wounded 283 more, the victims mainly schoolgirls, women, and children, with buildings up to 600 feet away destroyed. Despite the massive explosion, the bombers had missed their target completely. Fadlallah, surrounded by his supporters, simply walked away from the carnage. They did not kill him. They killed 80 innocent people while their target escaped. At CIA headquarters, Casey received word that the operation had gone horrifically wrong, marking a turning point that convinced many in the region that the West was willing to slaughter innocents indiscriminately. Worse still, it later transpired that the CIA's intelligence on Fadlallah from Israeli and Lebanese sources was deeply flawed. Over the next few years, the agency learned that Fadlallah had never been involved in any terrorist attacks against America. There was no evidence, none whatsoever, that he was directly involved in attacks on the West or Israel. He was not an active operational member of Hezbollah, never at any time. The critical lesson that Casey learned was that the CIA needed better intelligence on its enemies and more accurate ways of targeting them. A year after the Fadlallah attack, Casey set up a new CIA department, the Counterterrorism Center, bringing together espionage people and analysts to work together for virtually the first time in the agency's history. This revolution ensured that, unlike in Beirut, the CIA would now always try to have its own agents on the ground, providing highly accurate intelligence direct to the agency's best analysts, no longer forced to rely on foreign intelligence and local assets. In 1986, the Counterterrorism Center started developing a new way to accurately target enemies, an unmanned aerial vehicle, the beginning of where we are today with lethal drones, the genesis born directly from the failures in Beirut.